Do as I said, or quit. The CEO expected another frightened employee to fold. Instead, the black single dad quietly closed his laptop, packed his worn canvas bag, and walked out without saying a single word, leaving an entire factory frozen in disbelief. What nobody inside that glass room realized was that his silence wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of a truth powerful enough to bring an entire company to its knees. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I've got another unforgettable story coming your way soon. Before we jump back in, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and who's listening from around the world. Now, let's get back to the story. The 7th floor of Halden Manufacturing sat behind glass walls, the kind that let executives watch the factory floor without ever stepping onto it. From up there, the line workers looked small, uniform, replaceable. That was the point. Jean Jones stood at the head of the conference table with her arms crossed, watching the man across from her fold his hands together and say nothing. She was used to silence. Silence usually meant she'd won. "Do as I said," she told him, "or quit." 5 words. She had used some version of them for 20 years, and 20 years of results told her they worked every time. Ben Ponce sat still for a moment, hands resting on the closed lid of his laptop. Outside the glass, dozens of workers on the floor below had already stopped moving, sensing something was happening up here, even if they couldn't hear the words. He was 44 years old, a single father. His daughter Marie was 16 and waiting for him at home, probably already annoyed that dinner wasn't started. He had a mortgage payment due on the 14th. He had exactly 1 paycheck between his family and trouble, same as most of the people watching from the floor. Jean already knew all of that. She'd built her whole management style around knowing it. People with debt didn't walk away from a paycheck. People with children didn't gamble with stability. She had read men like Ben 100 times over, and she had never once misjudged what they'd do next. Ben stood up. He didn't argue. He didn't ask her to reconsider, and he didn't remind her what her order actually meant, that she wanted him to sign off on machinery he knew hadn't passed inspection, so the line could reopen 3 days before regulators came back through. He'd said all of that already, twice, in language plain enough that no one in that room could pretend not to understand it. There was nothing left to repeat. He picked his laptop up off the table and slid it into the same canvas duffel bag he'd carried to this job for 11 years. The strap worn soft and gray, where his shoulder had rubbed it 1,000 times. He zipped the bag. He looked at Jean once, not with anger, not with the kind of pleading she was expecting to see cross his face at the last second. Then he walked toward the door. Jean's mouth opened like she meant to say something else, some final line meant to pull him back into the room, but nothing came out fast enough. By the time she found the words, he was already through the doorway and moving down the open stairwell that led onto the factory floor. Every worker down there saw him coming before they heard anything. Word hadn't spread yet about what had actually been said upstairs, only that Ben Ponce, the man who ran 3 shifts without ever raising his voice, was walking out with his bag over his shoulder in the middle of a Tuesday. Nobody called out to him. A few people stepped aside without meaning to, the way you do when you sense you shouldn't be standing in someone's path. He didn't look at any of them directly, not because he didn't care, but because looking too long at people he'd worked beside for a decade might have made him stop moving altogether, and stopping wasn't something he could afford to do right now. Near the loading dock, a younger machinist named Ray stopped stacking pallets long enough to watch Ben pass. He'd worked under Ben for 6 years, and had never once seen him raise his voice at a single person on that floor, not even the ones who deserved it. Ray opened his mouth to ask what happened, then closed it again. Something about the way Ben carried that bag told him not to. He pushed through the exit doors and out into a parking lot lit gray by an overcast sky, the kind of afternoon that made everything look a little more permanent than it actually was. Behind him, through the glass wall of the control room, 2 stories up, Jean Jones watched him cross the lot toward his truck, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't have a next move. Ben reached his truck and stood there for a second, before opening the door, one hand resting flat on the roof. He wasn't second-guessing it. He was just letting the moment settle into his body the way a decision does once it's finally made, instead of only imagined. She had built an entire career on one belief, that everyone breaks eventually, if you find the right pressure and apply it in the right place. Debt. Family. Fear of starting over past 40. She had used all three on people far more stubborn than Ben Ponce, and it had never failed her yet. She had watched men twice his age crumble at the mention of a mortgage. She had watched women with far less to lose fold the moment she brought up their kids' college funds. It was never personal, at least not to her. It was just leverage, applied correctly. She turned to the executive standing beside her, a younger man already reaching for his phone to call downstairs about the paperwork, and she said nothing, because there wasn't anything worth saying. Not yet. What she didn't know, standing there behind that glass, was that Ben hadn't just made this decision in the last 10 minutes. He'd made it years earlier, on a night she'd never hear about, after watching a friend get carried out of that same building on a stretcher because somebody upstairs had decided a repair could wait one more quarter. She thought she was watching a man throw away his paycheck out of stubborn pride. She had no idea she was watching a man finally use the thing he'd spent years quietly preparing, folder by folder, in a box under his bed that his own daughter had never once asked about. Ben started his truck, pulled out of the lot, and drove home to a daughter who had no idea her father had just walked out of the only job she'd ever known him to have, or why. By the time he turned onto their street, he had already decided not to tell her the whole truth tonight. Not yet. Some things, he figured, needed to be earned before they could be understood. Marie Ponce was setting 2 plates on the kitchen table when she heard her father's truck pull into the driveway earlier than usual. She checked the clock on the stove, 4:15. He never got home before 6. Not on a Tuesday, not during a production push. She met him at the door with a question already forming, and he answered it before she could ask, telling her he'd left work early and didn't feel like talking about it yet. Marie knew her father well enough to hear what wasn't in that sentence. She let it go, for now, and went back to setting the table like nothing was wrong, even though something clearly was. She watched him from the kitchen doorway as he sat down at the small desk in the hallway where he kept his bills and his paperwork, the same desk he disappeared to most evenings after dinner. Tonight he sat there before dinner had even started, staring at nothing in particular. Marie had grown up thinking that desk was just where boring adult things happened. She had no reason yet to think of it as anything else. 12 miles away, Jean Jones was still standing in the same conference room, watching her assistant gather papers off the table like the meeting had gone exactly as planned. It hadn't, and everyone in that building would know it by morning. Jean had spent 20 years building Halden Manufacturing into something bigger than her father had ever imagined it could be, and she'd done it by learning one skill better than anyone else in her position: reading people before they knew they were being read. She could walk into a room of 40 employees and identify within minutes who was drowning in credit card debt, who had a sick parent, who was quietly terrified of starting over at their age, in a job market that didn't want them. She never used that information cruelly, at least not in her own mind. She used it efficiently. A man worried about his mortgage wasn't going to risk his paycheck over a policy he disagreed with. A woman putting a kid through community college wasn't going to file a formal complaint that might cost her the overtime she depended on. Jean didn't see this as manipulation. She saw it as understanding her workforce better than anyone else could, and for 2 decades, that understanding had never once failed her. Until this afternoon, she replayed the file on Ben Ponce in her head, the same file she'd studied before ever calling him into that room. 44, widower, 1 daughter, 16, a modest house 11 minutes from the plant, still carrying a mortgage with 9 years left on it. No savings account large enough to survive more than a few months without income. On paper, Ben Ponce was the easiest kind of employee to pressure, a man with everything to lose and nothing to fall back on. What the file hadn't told her was who Ben actually was underneath all of that. 3 years earlier, before Jean had ever needed anything from him beyond competent supervision, Ben had quietly turned down a promotion to plant manager. The reason never made it into any official record. He'd been offered the position after a round of budget cuts that would have required him to sign off on reduced maintenance schedules across 2 production lines. the same lines that had been flagged twice already for wear beyond safe tolerance. Ben had told the regional director at the time that he'd rather keep his current title than put his name on a decision like that. The promotion went to someone else. Nobody upstairs thought much of it. It was filed away as an odd, if admirable, decision by a man who apparently didn't want more responsibility. That wasn't what it was. It was the first time Ben Ponce had quietly drawn a line he wasn't willing to cross, and it wouldn't be the last. There had been smaller moments too, ones nobody upstairs had ever connected into a pattern. Ben was the supervisor who insisted on full inspection paperwork even when a rush order made it tempting to skip a step. He was the one who reported a cracked hydraulic line the same day it appeared, instead of waiting to see if it would hold through the shift. He'd never made noise about any of it. He simply did his job the way it was supposed to be done, and let the paperwork speak for itself. Jean had noticed none of this, because none of it had ever cost her anything before today. Ben's caution had always worked in her favor, keeping the plant running without incidents that might draw regulatory attention. She had mistaken his consistency for compliance. She assumed a man who followed rules that closely would also follow orders that closely, regardless of what those orders actually required. She was beginning to understand, standing alone in that glass room with the light changing outside, that she had confused two very different things. Her assistant, a sharp young man named Corey, who had been with her for 2 years, cleared his throat and asked if she wanted him to start drafting a replacement plan for Ben's position. Jean didn't answer right away. She was thinking about the way Ben had looked at her before he walked out, not with anger, and not with the kind of desperate calculation she was used to seeing in that final moment before someone folded. He'd looked at her like he already knew something she didn't. That thought bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "Draft it," she finally said, turning back toward her desk. But quietly. "I don't want rumors moving faster than we can manage them." Corey nodded and left the room, already pulling out his phone to make calls. Jean sat down at the head of the table, where Ben had been sitting less than an hour earlier, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she had misjudged someone completely. Not the outcome. She was still confident the outcome would go her way eventually, the same way it always had. It was the timeline she was suddenly unsure about, and the growing sense that Ben Ponce hadn't reacted to her ultimatum at all. He had simply executed a decision he'd made long before she ever walked into that room. What John had asked Ben to do wasn't complicated. That was what made it worse. 2 weeks earlier, an inspection of production line 4 had turned up wear on a hydraulic press, well past the tolerance allowed under state safety code. The part needed replacing, not patching, and the replacement was 6 weeks out from the supplier. Corporate had already promised investors the line would be running again by the end of the month, before a scheduled visit from state regulators, who'd flagged the same equipment during a routine audit the previous year. Jean's solution had been simple on paper. She needed someone with the authority to sign the safety certification to say the line met code, whether or not it actually did. She needed it signed by someone regulators trusted, someone whose name on that document wouldn't raise questions. Ben Ponce had been the senior supervisor of record on that line for 6 years. His signature meant something. That was exactly why she wanted it. She hadn't asked him outright at first. She'd framed it as a formality, telling him the paperwork just needed updating before the walkthrough, and that engineering would handle any lingering concerns after the fact. Ben had read the actual inspection report before she finished the sentence. He knew what she was really asking. Sign the document saying the press was safe, knowing it wasn't, so the line could restart, and investors could stop asking questions for another quarter. He'd told her no, plainly, the first time she raised it. She brought it up again 2 days later, softer, framing his hesitation as an overreaction to a repair timeline that was, in her words, more conservative than necessary. He told her no, a second time. That was when the conversation in the conference room happened, the one that ended with her final ultimatum and Ben walking out with his bag over his shoulder. By Wednesday morning, less than 18 hours after Ben's truck had pulled out of the parking lot, a junior operations manager named Trevor Aldridge sat in the same conference chair Ben had occupied, reviewing the same certification paperwork. Trevor was 29, ambitious in the specific way that made him easy to work with if you were Gene Jones. He'd been passed over for 2 promotions already, and had made no secret of wanting this one. When Jean explained what she needed from him, in almost the same soft, formality-laced language she'd used with Ben, Trevor didn't ask the questions Ben had asked. He read the summary page, saw the words, "Certification pending final engineering sign-off," and didn't look any further than that. He told himself, walking out of that meeting, that this was simply how decisions got made at his level now, that people above him had already weighed the risks more carefully than he ever could. It was easier to believe that than to ask a second question he suspected he wouldn't like the answer to. He signed it that afternoon. Production Line 4 restarted the following morning at 6:30, the same time it always had, the machinery groaning back to life under fluorescent lights, while workers filed in for first shift, with no idea anything unusual had happened. A few of them had heard that Ben Ponce quit or got fired, depending on who was telling the story. Nobody connected his absence to the equipment they were standing next to. By the end of the day, corporate had sent a note down congratulating the team on hitting the reopening deadline. Jean forwarded it to the plant with a short message of her own, thanking everyone for their flexibility during a challenging week. Trevor received a separate note, privately, informing him he'd be considered for the plant manager position that had been sitting open since the last round of cuts. At home, Ben spent that same evening at his hallway desk with the door mostly closed, going through a locked filing box he kept under his bed. Marie noticed the box for the first time that week, though she didn't ask about it directly. She noticed her father reading through old photographs and printed emails with a kind of focus she'd never seen him bring to ordinary paperwork. When she asked what he was working on, he told her he was just organizing some old files, which was technically true, and told her almost nothing. She stood in the doorway a moment longer than usual, half expecting him to say more, and when he didn't, she went back to her homework, filing the whole thing away as one more strange thing about this strange week. What Marie didn't know yet was that the box contained 3 years of documentation, inspection reports Ben had personally requested copies of, photographs he'd taken of equipment flagged for repair, emails from maintenance staff warning about parts on backorder, and his own handwritten notes from conversations with supervisors who'd been told to keep production moving, regardless of what the paperwork said. He hadn't built the file because he expected this exact situation. He'd built it because he'd learned years earlier that verbal warnings disappeared, and written ones didn't. Back at the plant, Line 4 ran without incident for the rest of that first week, which Jean took as confirmation that her assessment of the risk had been correct all along. She'd read enough safety reports over the years to convince herself that the state's tolerance thresholds carried more caution than necessary, that most flagged equipment ran fine for months past the point regulators would prefer. She wasn't reckless in her own mind. She was pragmatic, balancing a risk she considered manageable against a shutdown that would have cost the company millions and put hundreds of workers on unpaid leave. She had no way of knowing that the same press had already begun vibrating slightly off its mounting during the 3rd shift on Thursday, a detail the night crew noted in a maintenance log that wouldn't reach anyone above supervisor level until it was too late to matter. Ben didn't know about the vibration either. Not yet. He wasn't at the plant anymore to notice it, but he'd spent 6 years learning exactly how that machine sounded when something was wrong, and some part of him, sitting at his desk 2 towns away, kept waiting for a phone call he hoped never came. By the following week, the house felt different in ways Marie couldn't quite name. Her father was home every evening now, which should have felt like a gift after years of double shifts and overtime, except it didn't. He was there, but distracted, checking his phone more than usual, and then setting it face down like he didn't want her to see the screen. The bills started arriving differently too. Marie noticed her father sitting at the hallway desk longer than usual one night, a calculator next to a stack of envelopes she recognized as the mortgage statement and something from the electric company. He didn't complain about any of it in front of her. He never had, but she was 16, not stupid, and she knew what it looked like when a man was doing math he didn't want to be doing. At school, one of her friends mentioned that her own father worked at Halden and had heard Ben Ponce got walked out by security after some kind of argument with management. Marie corrected her, said her dad quit. He wasn't fired, though even as she said it, she realized she didn't actually know which version was true. Nobody had told her the real story. Her father hadn't offered it, and she hadn't found the right moment to ask directly, worried that pushing might make whatever this was feel more real than she was ready for. She spent the rest of that class period only half listening to her teacher, replaying the conversation and wondering how many other people at school already knew more about her own family than she did. What Marie didn't know, and wouldn't learn for weeks, was that her father's caution hadn't started with Gene Jones or Production Line 4. It had started 9 years earlier, on a Thursday afternoon in the plant's East Wing, back when Ben was still a floor technician instead of a supervisor. A friend of his, named Walter Kessler, had been working a stamping press that day, one that had been flagged for a worn safety guard 3 separate times over the previous 2 months. Each time, a work order had been filed. Each time, the repair got pushed to the following quarter to preserve the maintenance budget for something considered more urgent. Nobody above supervisor level had ever seen those work orders personally. They existed in a system, technically, filed and forgotten. The guard failed on a Thursday afternoon. Walter lost 2 fingers on his left hand and nearly lost the whole hand before emergency crews got him stabilized. Ben had been 40 feet away when it happened, close enough to hear it, close enough that he still sometimes heard an echo of that sound in machinery that was making no unusual noise at all. In the investigation that followed, plant management pointed to Walter's own technique as a contributing factor, a claim that wasn't entirely false, but conveniently avoided mentioning the 3 ignored work orders sitting in a maintenance file nobody upstairs had bothered to read. Walter received a settlement large enough to cover his medical bills and not much else. He never worked at Halden again. Ben visited him twice a month for the first year afterward, then once a month, then eventually just on holidays, the way friendships sometimes fade even when nobody intends for them to. What stayed with Ben longer than the friendship was the silence in that investigation. Nobody outside the maintenance department had ever known those work orders existed until Ben himself dug them up afterward, out of guilt more than obligation, and even then, nothing came of it beyond a quiet acknowledgement that procedures could be improved going forward. That was the moment Ben decided he would never again depend on a system to remember what it was supposed to remember. From that point on, he kept his own copies of everything. Every inspection report that crossed his desk, he photographed before filing the original. Every maintenance request he submitted, he saved a copy of the email confirmation. Every conversation where a supervisor told him production mattered more than a repair timeline, he wrote down afterward, date and time, while the details were still fresh. He never told anyone he was doing this, not even Marie's mother while she was still alive, not because he thought it was shameful, but because explaining it required explaining Walter, and explaining Walter required reliving an afternoon he'd rather not revisit more than necessary. Over the years, the habit stopped feeling like grief and started feeling like discipline, something he did the way other people checked locks before bed, a small ritual that let him sleep without wondering what he might have missed. By the time Gene Jones asked him to sign off on Production Line 4, Ben already had 6 years of documentation on that specific hydraulic press alone, including 2 inspection reports flagging the exact wear pattern that eventually failed. He hadn't needed to think hard about his answer. He'd already lived through what happens when a company decides a repair can wait 1 more quarter. Marie knew none of this. What she knew was that her father had started spending time at that desk with an intensity she'd never seen before, and that dinner conversations had gotten quieter, and that when she asked if everything was okay, he told her yes, in a tone that suggested he wanted to believe it more than he actually did. One evening, clearing plates after dinner, she asked him directly why he'd left Halden. He set down the dish towel he was holding and looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that told her he was deciding how much truth she could handle at 16. "I made a decision I had to make," he told her. "One day I'll explain the whole thing. Right now, I just need you to trust that I didn't do this because I stopped caring about us." Marie wanted to push further, but something in his voice told her this wasn't the night for it. She nodded instead, cleared the last plate, and went to finish her homework, carrying a question she suspected wouldn't have an answer for a while yet. She had no way of knowing that answer was already sitting in a locked box under her father's bed, waiting for the moment it would matter more than either of them could predict. The rumors moved faster than any official explanation ever could have. By the second week, most of the plant had settled on a version of events that made sense to people who hadn't been in that conference room. Ben Ponce had gotten spooked by a tough conversation with Jean Jones and walked out before she could fire him first. Some said he'd been caught padding his overtime hours and quit ahead of an audit. Others swore he'd simply had enough of Halden after years of being passed over and finally snapped. Nobody's version involved a safety certification or a hydraulic press, because nobody outside that conference room knew those details existed. Trevor Aldridge, meanwhile, had become something close to a hero on the floor. He'd stepped in during a crisis, kept Line 4 running, kept paychecks coming, kept the plant from a shutdown that would have hurt everyone standing on it. Workers who barely knew his name a month earlier now nodded to him in the hallway with something like respect. Jean made sure his name came up positively in the plant-wide newsletter, a short paragraph praising his composure under pressure. Ben's name came up too, though not the way his had once been spoken. Jean never said anything overtly negative about him in public settings. She didn't need to. In private conversations with department heads, she framed his departure as a cautionary example, a man who let personal pride override his responsibility to the people depending on him. She never used cruel language. She simply let the framing do the work, and it worked exactly as she intended. A private social media group used by several second-shift workers picked up the story within days. Someone posted that Ben had left them all hanging right before a round of expected layoffs, timing his exit to protect himself while everyone else stayed exposed. The post got dozens of comments agreeing, a handful defending him weakly, and no real correction, because nobody defending him actually knew what had happened either. One comment, from a woman Ben had trained personally his first year as supervisor, said she never expected him of all people to leave everyone behind like that. It stayed near the top of the thread for days, liked far more than anything written in his favor. Ray, the young machinist who'd watched Ben walk out that first afternoon, tried calling him twice that week. Ben let both calls go to voicemail. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk to Ray specifically. It was that any real conversation about why he'd left required explaining details he wasn't ready to make public yet, not until he understood exactly how this was going to play out, and not until he had enough documentation organized to make the explanation land the way it needed to. Ray eventually stopped calling, telling himself Ben would reach out when he was ready, though a small part of him started to wonder if the rumors circulating the break room held more truth than he wanted to believe. His silence, though understandable to him, read as guilt to everyone watching from outside. A man with nothing to hide would defend himself, people reasoned. A man who stayed quiet probably had something he didn't want anyone looking into too closely. Marie felt the shift too, in smaller ways. A neighbor who used to wave every morning now offered a tighter, more distant nod. A woman at the grocery store, someone her father had worked alongside for years, looked away when she saw Marie in the cereal aisle, instead of stopping to chat the way she normally would have. Nobody said anything cruel directly to her, but the quiet distancing was its own kind of message, and Marie was old enough to read it clearly. At home, Ben absorbed all of it without complaint, though Marie noticed the toll it was taking, even if he tried to hide it from her. He'd started sleeping less. She heard him some nights, still awake at the hallway desk long after she'd gone to bed, papers rustling, occasionally a long silence that somehow felt louder than any sound would have. She wanted to ask him directly why he didn't just explain himself to everyone and clear the whole thing up. She almost did, twice, standing in the kitchen doorway with the question ready. Both times, something about the exhaustion on his face stopped her. What Marie didn't understand yet, and what Ben couldn't explain without risking everything, was that defending himself too early could destroy the only leverage he had. If word got out that he was sitting on years of documentation proving Halden had knowingly certified unsafe equipment, corporate lawyers would move immediately to discredit him, to frame his records as fabricated or exaggerated, to bury the story before regulators ever saw a single page. He needed the timing to be right. He needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away by a company legal team with more resources than he'd ever have. So he waited, absorbing the rumors, the cold shoulders, the quiet judgment of people he'd worked beside for over a decade, all while knowing the full truth sat locked in a box 11 feet from where he slept every night. One evening, Marie came home from school and found her father sitting on the porch steps instead of at his desk, staring out at nothing in particular. She sat down next to him without saying anything at first, the way you do with someone you love when you don't have the right words yet. "People think I abandoned everybody," he finally said, more to himself than to her. Marie didn't answer right away. She thought about the neighbor's tight nod, the woman in the grocery store, the whispers she'd overheard from kids whose parents worked the same floor her father used to. "Did you?" she asked quietly, not accusing him, just needing to hear him say it. Ben looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No," he said. "But I understand why it looks that way, and I'm not ready to explain it yet. I need you to trust me a little longer." Marie nodded, even though trusting him without understanding was getting harder every single day. She stayed on the porch a while longer, neither of them saying much else, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one down the block, both of them carrying a version of the same silence for entirely different reasons. If you've ever been misunderstood for doing the right thing, subscribe. Some battles aren't fought to be applauded, they're fought because they're right. 3 weeks after production line 4 restarted, it was running better than anyone at Halden had expected. Output numbers came in ahead of projection 2 weeks running. Corporate sent another congratulatory note, this one mentioning a possible bonus structure for the operations team if the trend held through the quarter. Trevor Aldridge's name appeared near the top of that email, and Jean Jones felt, for the first time since Ben walked out, that she'd made exactly the right call. She mentioned this, in passing, to Corey one afternoon while reviewing quarterly numbers. Ben Ponce had let his personal feelings about a repair schedule nearly cost the company a production quarter, she said, and the plant had proven perfectly capable of running without him. Corey nodded along, the way an assistant learns to nod along, and neither of them thought much more about it that day. Nobody was thinking about the hydraulic press specifically that Thursday morning when second shift came in. Nobody had reason to. The maintenance log from 3 weeks earlier, the one noting a slight vibration off the mounting, had been reviewed by a mid-level technician who judged it within acceptable range and moved on to the next item on his checklist. It wasn't negligence exactly. It was the kind of routine dismissal that happens 100 times a day in a plant running at full capacity, the kind that only looks like a mistake after something goes wrong. At 2:47 that afternoon, the press failed. The mounting bolts that had been vibrating loose for weeks finally gave way entirely, and the entire press assembly shifted nearly a foot off its base mid-cycle, sending a section of guarding and loose hardware across the work area in a spray that took out 2 support brackets on an adjacent line before the emergency stop finally triggered. 3 workers standing within 15 feet of the press dove clear in the seconds before impact. One of them, a woman named Denise Okafor, who'd been on that line for 4 years, took a glancing hit from a piece of flying guardrail that fractured her forearm. It could have been much worse. Everyone on that floor understood, within minutes of it happening, exactly how much worse it could have been. For a few long seconds after the emergency stop engaged, nobody moved at all, the whole section frozen, in the kind of silence that follows a sound nobody on that floor would ever fully forget. The plant shut down immediately. First shift and second shift both sent home, while emergency crews and, within the hour, state safety inspectors arrived to assess the damage. This wasn't a routine audit anymore. A workplace injury involving equipment failure triggered mandatory investigation, and investigators wanted every piece of documentation related to that press going back as far as records existed. Jean was in her office when she got the call. She'd expected many outcomes from her decision weeks earlier, but not this specific one. Not an actual injury, not state investigators walking her plant floor within hours of an incident that could easily have killed someone instead of breaking an arm. She authorized full cooperation with the investigation, the only reasonable choice available to her, and then sat alone in her office, turning over the same question she couldn't quite silence. How much of this had she genuinely believed was manageable, and how much had she simply wanted to believe because the alternative was too expensive? The investigators pulled every maintenance record, every inspection report, every certification document tied to Line 4. Trevor's signature appeared exactly where it was supposed to, on the certification approving the line's reopening. What the investigators found alongside it, buried in older files nobody had thought to scrub, were the original inspection reports from 6 weeks earlier. The ones flagging wear well past safe tolerance. The ones that predated Trevor's certification and directly contradicted it. An investigator named Patricia Nwosu, leading the site review, asked to speak with whoever had supervised Line 4 before the certification was signed. She was told that supervisor had left the company. She asked why. Nobody in the room had a clean answer ready. That evening, at home, Ben heard about the incident from Ray, who called him for the first time in weeks, voice shaking slightly, as he described what had happened on the floor that afternoon. Ben sat at his hallway desk while Ray talked, one hand resting on the locked box beside him, feeling something between relief that nobody had died and a cold, settling dread that this was exactly the outcome he'd spent years trying to prevent, arriving anyway despite everything he'd done to stop it. Ray asked, more than once, whether Ben had known something like this might happen. Ben told him only that he'd had concerns, careful not to say more than that until he understood exactly what the investigation would ask him, and when. "They're saying investigators are already asking about you," Ray told him, "asking why you left right before all this." Ben didn't answer immediately. He'd known this moment might come eventually, but hearing it confirmed still landed harder than he expected. "I need you to trust me a little longer," he told Ray, the same words he'd told Marie weeks earlier, though this time they felt less like a request and more like a countdown finally reaching its final numbers. After he hung up, Ben sat with the box for a long time, running his fingers along the edge of the lid without opening it yet. Marie found him there an hour later, still sitting, still quiet, and this time she didn't ask what was wrong. She simply sat down beside him, the way he had sat with silence beside her before, and waited for him to be ready. "Someone got hurt today," he finally said, "at the plant. Because of the exact thing I refused to sign off on." Marie felt something shift inside her chest, a piece of the story finally sliding into place, even though the full picture was still out of reach. "Was it bad?" she asked. "Could have been a lot worse," Ben said. "It's about to get complicated, Marie. People are going to start asking questions, and some of the answers involve me." Marie nodded slowly, understanding for the first time that whatever her father had been carrying in silence for weeks was about to become impossible to keep quiet any longer. The investigation moved faster than Halden's legal team wanted it to, mostly because Patricia Nwosu had seen this particular pattern before and knew exactly which documents to request first. She started with maintenance logs, then cross-referenced them against every certification signed in the past 6 months. The gap she found wasn't subtle once she knew where to look. Trevor Aldridge's signature approved Line 4 as meeting code on a date that fell nearly 3 weeks after an inspection report flagging the exact same equipment for critical wear. When investigators brought Trevor in for formal questioning, he didn't try to defend the discrepancy for long. He told them, plainly, that he'd been given a summary page by Jean Jones and had signed, based on her assurance, that engineering would handle any outstanding concerns. He hadn't read the full inspection report himself. He assumed, given the pressure to reopen the line before the scheduled regulatory visit, that someone above him had already weighed the risk properly. It was the kind of admission that ended careers, and Trevor understood that the moment the words left his mouth. He asked, near the end of his interview, whether the investigation would consider his cooperation when it came time to determine any consequences, and Patricia told him honestly that it would help, though it wouldn't erase what his signature had already put in motion. Patricia asked the obvious next question: who had supervised Line 4 before Trevor, and why had that person left so abruptly right before the certification was signed? Ben Ponce's name came up formally in the investigation for the first time that afternoon. Investigators reached out to him the following morning, requesting an interview about Line 4's condition prior to his departure. Ben agreed immediately, which surprised the investigator who called him, since most people in his position hired a lawyer first and answered questions second. Ben said he'd cooperate fully and asked only for a day to organize his records before the interview, so nothing would get lost in translation. That night, he finally opened the box in front of Marie. She sat across from him at the kitchen table while he laid out folder after folder, each one labeled by date and equipment ID, years of inspection reports and photographs and printed emails spread across the surface where they usually ate dinner. He walked her through it slowly, starting with Walter Kessler's accident 9 years earlier, explaining for the first time why that afternoon had changed the way he approached every job afterward. He told her about the 2 fingers Walter lost, about the ignored work orders nobody upstairs had ever bothered to read, and about the quiet decision he'd made afterward to never again let a warning disappear into a system that didn't care to remember it. "I started keeping copies of everything after that," he told her, "not because I thought I'd need it someday, because I couldn't stand the idea of something like that happening again and nobody being able to prove it could have been prevented." Marie looked through the photographs slowly, seeing dates going back years, long before Jean Jones had ever asked him to sign anything. She understood, looking at the sheer volume of it, that her father hadn't built this file in a moment of panic after the ultimatum in that conference room. He'd been building it quietly, patiently, for the better part of a decade, waiting for a day he hoped would never come. "This is why you wouldn't sign it," she said, more statement than question. "This is why," Ben confirmed. "Signing that certification meant lying about something I had years of proof was dangerous. I couldn't do that, even knowing what it would cost us." Marie sat with that for a long moment, feeling something complicated settle into place. Pride and fear tangled together in a way she didn't have words for yet. The following week, Ben sat across from Patricia Nwosu and 2 other investigators, walking them through his documentation piece by piece. He answered every question directly, without exaggeration, without trying to make himself look better than the record already made him look. He explained the repeated warnings he'd given verbally and in writing, the meetings where he'd been told production mattered more than a repair timeline, and the final ultimatum that had ended with him walking out rather than signing his name to something false. The investigation's findings, once finalized, didn't leave much room for interpretation. Every warning Ben had documented traced directly back to decisions made in Jean Jones's office. The pattern wasn't a single lapse in judgment. It was a repeated choice, made across multiple pieces of equipment over several years, to prioritize production schedules over documented safety concerns. Word of the findings reached the plant floor before the official report was even finished. The way news like that always seemed to travel faster than any memo could keep up with. Workers who had spent weeks believing Ben abandoned them at the worst possible moment started hearing a very different version of events, one where he'd tried to stop this exact outcome and paid for it with his job and his reputation. The same woman whose comment about Ben leaving everyone behind had topped the social media thread weeks earlier posted again, this time admitting she'd gotten it completely wrong. The post didn't get as many likes as the first one had. It got something quieter and more genuine instead, a string of replies from people admitting they'd believed the worst without ever asking Ben directly what had actually happened. Ray called Ben that evening, apologizing for doubting him even briefly, his voice thick with something between relief and embarrassment. "You should have just told us," Ray said. "We would have believed you." "I couldn't risk it," Ben told him honestly. "Not until I knew the investigation would protect what I'd documented, instead of letting the company bury it first. If I'd said anything too early, they would have had time to build a story around it before anyone official saw a single page." Ray was quiet for a moment, letting that sink in. "Makes sense," he finally said. "Still wish you'd trusted me a little sooner." "I trusted you the whole time," Ben told him. "I just couldn't afford to trust the timing." Marie, listening from the next room, finally understood the full shape of what her father had carried alone for weeks. And for the first time since the day he walked out of Halden, she felt something closer to certainty than doubt. On a Saturday evening, 2 weeks after the investigation's findings became public, Marie looked out the living room window and counted 11 cars parked along their street, more arriving as she watched. She hadn't been expecting anyone. Neither had her father, who came to stand beside her at the window, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his expression somewhere between confusion and quiet dread. "Did you invite people over?" she asked. "No," Ben said, watching another car pull to the curb. "I have no idea what this is." By the time the last car parked, 15 vehicles lined both sides of the block, most of them familiar from years of company picnics and shift changes Ben had organized himself. Workers climbed out slowly, some in work clothes still dusty from a Saturday shift, others dressed like they'd come straight from somewhere else, all of them moving toward the house, with the careful, hesitant pace of people unsure whether they'd be welcome. Ben opened the door before anyone had to knock. Denise Okafor stood at the front of the group, her forearm still in a cast from the accident, a folded piece of paper clutched in her good hand, like she'd written something down and was afraid of forgetting it in the moment. Behind her stood Ray, along with a dozen others Ben had worked alongside for years, people who'd spent weeks believing he'd abandoned them, and were now standing on his porch trying to figure out how to say they'd been wrong. A few of them Marie recognized from her father's old work photos. Others she'd only heard mentioned in passing, names attached to shifts and departments she'd never fully understood until now. Denise spoke first. "We wanted to come say this in person," she said, her voice steady despite the visible effort it took. Not through some post online, not through a rumor, in person. She unfolded the paper but didn't read from it, seeming to have memorized whatever she'd written down beforehand. "We believed the worst about you because it was easier than asking questions we didn't want the answers to. You quit your job to protect people who spent weeks calling you a coward behind your back. I don't know how to make up for that, but I wanted you to hear it directly." Ben stood in the doorway for a long moment before responding, Marie watching from just behind him, close enough to see how carefully he was choosing his words. "You don't owe me an apology," he finally said. "You owe yourselves better information, and now you have it. That's enough." Ray stepped forward next. "We would have believed you if you'd just told us what was going on." "Maybe," Ben said. "Or maybe corporate lawyers would have found a way to make my records look fabricated before anyone outside that plant ever took them seriously. I couldn't take that risk. I'm sorry that meant carrying this alone longer than any of us wanted." One by one, workers stepped forward to share pieces of what they'd heard, what they'd believed, and how it had shifted once the investigation's findings became public. A younger machinist Marie didn't recognize admitted he'd been the one who wrote the comment calling Ben a coward on the group page, and that he'd deleted it the moment he understood the truth, though deleting it felt insufficient compared to what he'd actually said. He apologized twice, unprompted, before Ben told him gently that he didn't need to keep repeating it, that the apology had already landed the first time. "Doing the right thing doesn't guarantee people will understand it," Ben told the group, his voice carrying the particular calm of someone who'd had weeks to sit with that exact truth. "Sometimes understanding comes later, if it comes at all. I made peace with that possibility before I ever walked out of that building. I wasn't doing it for gratitude. I was doing it because Denise, and everyone else standing on that floor, deserved better than what corporate was willing to give you." Denise's eyes filled, and she didn't try to hide it. "You could have just signed the paper and kept your job," she said. "Nobody would have blamed you." "I would have blamed myself," Ben said simply. "Every single day, waiting to see if the next shift was the one where something finally went wrong." Marie stood in the doorway watching her father speak with a steadiness she'd never fully appreciated before. Not like this. Not from the outside looking in at how the people who'd worked beside him for years actually saw him now that the truth had caught up to the rumors. She'd grown up assuming her father was simply careful, maybe overly so, spending evenings on paperwork instead of relaxing the way other parents did. Standing on that porch, watching grown men and women thank him with genuine emotion in their voices, she understood for the first time the actual weight of what careful had cost him, and what it had protected. It wasn't caution for its own sake. It had always been about them, about every person standing in front of her now, whether she'd realized it or not. The group stayed for nearly an hour, some sharing specific memories of times Ben had quietly caught a problem before it became dangerous, details Marie had never heard before that night. By the time the cars pulled away one by one, the street looked ordinary again, but something inside their house had shifted permanently. That night, after everyone had gone, Marie found her father back at the hallway desk, though this time he wasn't reviewing old files. He was simply sitting there, staring at nothing in particular, the way he had on the porch weeks earlier. "You okay?" she asked. "Better than I've been in weeks," he told her, and for the first time since he'd walked out of Halden, she believed him completely. She sat down across from him at the desk that had held so much of his silence over the past month. And for once, the quiet between them felt like relief instead of something either of them was avoiding. Outside, the last of the taillights disappeared down the street, and the house settled into a stillness neither of them had felt in a long time. Gene Jones had never once, in 20 years of running Halden Manufacturing, driven to an employee's house. Executives didn't do that. Employees came to executives, not the other way around. But she sat in her car outside Ben Ponce's modest two-story home on a quiet Tuesday evening, engine off, trying to figure out how to knock on a door belonging to a man whose life she'd nearly upended twice over. She'd spent the past 2 weeks watching her company absorb the fallout of the investigation. Trevor Aldridge had resigned before the board could vote on terminating him. Regulators had imposed a fine steep enough to make the board chair personally call her 3 times in 1 week. Reporters had started asking questions that used words like negligence and cover-up, words that followed a company long after the news cycle moved on. None of that was what brought her to Ben's driveway that evening, though. What brought her was a conversation she'd had with her own father years ago, back when she was young enough to still ask him for advice instead of giving orders to people twice her age. He'd told her once that the measure of a leader wasn't how many people feared disappointing you. It was how many people trusted you enough to tell you the truth, even when it cost them something. She'd forgotten that advice somewhere along the way, buried under 2 decades of believing fear was simply more efficient. Ben answered the door himself, Marie visible for a moment behind him, before she quietly withdrew to give them privacy. "I wasn't expecting you," he said, which was as close to hospitality as the moment allowed. "I wasn't expecting to come," Jean admitted. "Can we talk?" He let her in, and they sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where Ben had laid out his files for Marie weeks earlier. Jean noticed the hallway desk on her way in, papers still stacked neatly on top, and understood without asking that this was where years of quiet preparation had happened. "I misjudged you," Jean said, without preamble. "Completely. I built my entire management approach on the belief that everyone eventually chooses survival over principle, if the pressure is applied correctly. Debt, family, fear of starting over. I've used all 3 for 20 years, and it's never failed me. Until you." Ben considered that for a moment before responding. "I wasn't trying to prove a point," he said. "I wasn't thinking about your management philosophy at all, honestly. I was thinking about a man named Walter Kessler who lost 2 fingers because somebody decided a repair could wait 1 more quarter. I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to be the reason that happened to someone else." Jean absorbed that, the name meaning nothing to her, the weight of it meaning everything. "I didn't know about him," she said quietly. "Most people upstairs didn't," Ben said. "That's part of the problem." Jean sat with that for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. "I came here to offer you something," she finally said. "The board wants to bring you back in a senior role, plant manager at minimum, possibly regional oversight given everything that's happened. Substantial salary increase, equity in the company, public acknowledgement of what you tried to prevent." Ben shook his head slowly, not unkindly. "I don't want any of that." "Why not?" Jean asked, genuinely confused in a way that suggested she'd never once had this particular offer refused. "Because none of it fixes the actual problem," Ben said. "You could pay me more money than I've made in my entire career, and it wouldn't stop the next Trevor Aldridge from signing something he shouldn't, because somebody above him assured him it was fine. Money was never what this was about. Integrity isn't something you buy back after asking someone to sell it." Jean absorbed that sentence like it physically cost her something to hear. "Then what do you want?" she asked. "Because I came here prepared to give you almost anything reasonable, and you're telling me none of it matters." "I want changes that outlast both of us," Ben said. "Independent safety audits, conducted by inspectors who don't report to plant management and can't be pressured by production deadlines. An anonymous reporting system that actually gets read by someone with authority to act on it, not filed away in a system nobody checks. Written protection, real protection, for any employee who refuses an order they believe is unsafe or unethical. So the next person in my position doesn't have to choose between their family and their conscience the way I did." Jean was quiet for a long moment, running through what he'd asked for, against everything she knew about how her board typically responded to demands like this. "That's a significant restructuring," she said. "The board will push back on the cost, and probably the independence clause specifically." "Then you'll have to convince them," Ben said, "or explain to regulators why the company that just paid a fine for exactly this kind of decision refused a reform designed to prevent it happening again." It wasn't a threat, not the way Ben said it, but Jean understood the leverage in it anyway. The investigation's findings were public. Refusing reasonable reforms in the aftermath would look far worse to regulators and shareholders than implementing them would cost. "I'll bring it to the board," she said. "I can't promise they'll accept every piece exactly as you've described it, but I'll fight for it." "That's all I'm asking," Ben said. Jean stood to leave, pausing at the door before stepping out into the evening. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think I've ever been wrong about someone the way I was wrong about you. 20 years, and I never once considered that some people build their whole life around not needing to be bought. Most people don't get the chance to find out what they do," Ben said. "I got mine early, watching a friend get carried out on a stretcher. I hope you never have to learn it the same way I did." Jean nodded once, something in her expression Ben hadn't seen from her before, something closer to humility than he'd expected to ever witness in that particular woman. After she left, Marie came out from the hallway where she'd been quietly listening, sitting down across from her father at the same table Jean had just vacated. "Do you think she'll actually push the board for it?" Marie asked. "I think she wants to," Ben said. "Whether wanting to is enough, I honestly don't know yet." Marie considered that, watching her father's face for any sign of doubt about what he'd just turned down. She found none. "You just refused a promotion, and probably a lot of money," she said. "I did," Ben agreed. "Any regrets?" Ben thought about the question longer than she expected. "None," he finally said. "Money can replace a paycheck. It can't replace knowing I did the one thing that actually mattered when it counted." The board approved every reform Ben had asked for, though not without the friction Jean predicted. 2 members pushed back hard on the cost of an independent audit system, arguing the existing safety department was sufficient if properly funded and staffed. Jean overruled them, reminding the room that the existing system was precisely what had produced a fractured hydraulic press, an injured worker, and a state investigation with her name attached to every finding. Nobody argued after that. One board member asked, quietly, whether Jean was certain this was the right long-term direction for shareholder confidence. Jean told him confidence built on a system that nearly killed someone wasn't confidence worth protecting. Halden announced the changes publicly a month later, in a statement that surprised industry reporters who'd expected the usual language, vague commitments to reviewing internal processes and reinforcing our culture of safety. Instead, the announcement named specifics. An independent auditing firm with no financial ties to Halden would conduct quarterly inspections across every production line, with findings reported directly to a state oversight board rather than filtered through internal management first. An anonymous reporting system would route concerns to that same external auditor, bypassing plant leadership entirely. Any employee who refused an order they believed compromised safety would be protected under a formal policy, with disciplinary action against that employee requiring sign-off from the new independent auditor before it could proceed. Jean gave a short statement alongside the announcement, one she'd drafted herself rather than leaving to a communications team accustomed to softer language. She acknowledged, plainly, that a senior executive had knowingly pressured an employee to falsify a safety certification, and that the company's prior culture had made that pressure possible in ways she was now responsible for correcting. She didn't name herself explicitly, but everyone who'd followed the story understood exactly who she meant. Trevor's resignation was accepted quietly, with no severance beyond what his contract legally required, though he avoided formal termination on his record, a small mercy Ben hadn't objected to when Jean mentioned it to him privately. He hadn't signed that certification out of malice, only out of the same fear the whole system had been built to exploit, and Ben understood that distinction well enough not to push for anything harsher. The morning Ben returned to Halden, he walked through the same front doors he'd walked out of, carrying the same canvas duffel bag, though this time it was empty, just a habit he hadn't broken yet. Word had spread through the plant that he was coming back, not as a favor, not quietly, but as the new independent safety liaison, a position created specifically at his insistence, answering directly to the external auditing firm, rather than to Gene or anyone else inside the company. The floor didn't stop working when he walked in, not the way it had frozen the day he left. Instead, one by one, workers noticed him and stopped what they were doing anyway, setting down tools, turning away from machinery, until a ripple of quiet spread across the entire production floor. Then someone started clapping. Ray, probably, though Ben never confirmed it afterward. Within seconds, the whole floor had joined in, applause echoing off the same glass walls where Gene had once delivered an ultimatum meant to end his career, instead of beginning something neither of them could have predicted. Ben stood there for a moment, letting it happen instead of rushing past it the way he might have a year earlier. He'd spent so long being the quiet one, the careful one, the man who documented instead of demanded, that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen clearly by people who mattered to him. Denise found him afterward, her cast finally off, flexing her wrist experimentally as she spoke. "Feels different in here already," she told him. "Give it time," Ben said. "Paper policies only mean something once people actually use them." "We will," Denise said, "especially now that we know somebody upstairs will actually listen." That evening, Marie made dinner for the first time in longer than she could remember, insisting her father sit and let her handle it for once. Over plates of chicken and rice, she asked him the question she'd been sitting with since the porch full of apologetic co-workers, since the night Gene showed up at their door, since every quiet evening at that hallway desk she'd once assumed was just where boring adult things happened. "Why did you risk everything?" she asked. "You could have signed that paper, kept your job, kept things easy for us." Ben set down his fork, considering the question the way he considered most things, slowly and honestly. "A paycheck can replace a job," he told her. "It can never replace a life. Not Walter's, not Denise's, not anyone standing on that floor who trusted the equipment they worked with every single day. I wanted you to grow up knowing your father walked away from fear, not from people. Those are two very different things, even though they look the same from the outside sometimes." Marie sat with that for a while, turning it over the way she'd learned to do with most things her father told her lately, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion. "I used to think you cared more about paperwork than about us," she admitted. "I know that's not fair now. I just didn't understand what it was for." "You weren't supposed to understand it yet," Ben said. "I built that file for a day I hoped would never come. I'm sorry it finally did, and I'm sorry you had to watch me carry it alone for as long as I did." "I'm not," Marie said. "I got to watch you do the right thing when it actually cost you something. Most people never get to see that from anyone, let alone their own father." Ben reached across the table and took her hand, something he hadn't done in longer than either of them could easily place. Outside, the evening settled quietly over their street, the same street that had filled with cars full of apologies not long ago, the same house that had held so much silence for so many weeks. The following morning, Ben walked back through Halden's front doors again, this time without anyone stopping to watch, without applause, just an ordinary Tuesday at a plant finally operating the way it always should have. That ordinariness, more than anything else, felt like the actual victory. Not the reforms, not the apology, not even the return itself, but the simple fact that nobody on that floor had to wonder anymore whether the person in charge would choose their safety over a deadline. Ben Ponce had never wanted to be anyone's hero. He'd only ever wanted to be the kind of man his daughter could trust completely, and standing on that factory floor again, surrounded by machinery running the way it was supposed to, he finally felt like he'd become exactly that. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story meant something to you, I'd really love for you to subscribe. Before you go, leave a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read your comments, and I always enjoy seeing your thoughts and perspectives. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, just tap the next video on your screen. I'll see you there.